Hawker, welcome to you both. We're going to, a little later on, Graham, look at your attitudes towards women, which have seen you copping it for the last week. But first I want to start on school funding. The Prime Minister's blueprint unveiled today, 6 months or so after they received the recommendations from the Gonski panel. Graham, how do you think the PM went today in that speech at the Press Club?
Well, I don't think anyone could really fault the speech. I could have delivered that speech. It was a nice speech. It said education is important and kids are good. But the guts wasn't there. And apart from that, we've got this, we just keep building things up. Like we had the education revolution, and now we've got the wouldn't it be nice crusade. I suspect we'll be down to an arm wrestle between two canaries before the Labor Party does anything to improve education. It's missing the funding, it's missing the fact that the states have a big say in what this is all about. But the idea of, having more money spent on kids, trying to lift the standards in education, that's fine. But everyone's the same. Yeah. Everyone agrees with that.
There was a bit more to it.
No, there wasn't.
There was a bit more to it than that. There was a new funding model that Gonski recommended that's now been embraced.
Which is per student and whatnot.
All of that.
I seem to remember the Prime Minister and the Labor Party railing again when people like David Kemp and whatnot raised this years ago.
Right. Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, it's something that they've now embraced. But do you accept this argument? And you get the impression from what Peter Garrett was saying to us earlier, they do have figures in mind. They just don't want to negotiate publicly. You do this behind closed doors. Well, it's a bit different to what they did on some other issues, admittedly, but what do you think?
Well, look, I hope so. I hope there is a grand plan behind this. But when you think about it, the Prime Minister and Peter Garrett got handed a credit card. They buggered that credit card. And now we're spending money on somebody else's credit card. And this week we've had dental, we've had asylum, and now we've got massive education stuff. But somebody's got to pay for it. You and I can come up with the best plan on anything. I'd like to go and buy a Rolls Royce this afternoon on the Prime Minister's blinking credit card because it's a beauty.
This is, you can understand, I guess, from a political point of view, why the government doesn't want to get bogged down into a funding fight right now. It wants to sit down and privately, quietly talk to the states about all of this. But the problem is leaving this question unanswered after also announcing a new dental scheme, changes to the carbon tax, which could cost us a lot more in years to come. There's a growing question mark, isn't there, over how the government makes all of this add up?
Well, they're going to find savings, that's for sure. They're going to have negotiations with the with the state schools, the state system. There's going to be a lot of things happening there, but this idea that Labor hasn't fulfilled its commitments in areas like education in the past and somehow won't be able to fulfil this commitment is, frankly erroneous. Look at Kevin Rudd's education revolution, for example. 1 million new computers in schools, 3,000 new school libraries across the country, thousands of new classrooms and whiteboards, interactive whiteboards, 300 new trades training centres across the country. These are things that this government has achieved.
And science labs as well as part of that building the education revolution.
Exactly right.
But when we look at this crusade, as the Prime Minister called it today, after 6 months, do we deserve a bit more meat on the bone?
Well, I think it's going to be subject of significant negotiation and discussion with the states and the independent school system. As we know, about 70% of the school education budget is carried by the states. So the Commonwealth is going to have to sit down and have serious discussions and negotiations. My point is that certainly the Rudd government performed impeccably in the area of education. Julia Gillard's continued it with the NAP plan, and this is the next stage in a serious engagement when it comes to education. And I don't think it does Christopher Pyne or anybody else any credit just to be dismissive about it. This is a serious project underway, and it's very important for the future of Australia's education and its competitiveness in the 21st century to be able to have a decent education system.
Let's look at the politics of this. Labor was burnt under Mark Latham when he had the hit list of private schools that were going to lose money under his changes that never went ahead. Labor seems to have been far more careful this time around in going so far as to say that every school will receive increased funding. I mean, you can argue about indexation and whether they would be better off under the current model as opposed to this new one, but they're treading very, very carefully here, aren't they?
They are, and with good reason, because in 2004 we had a big uphill battle convincing people in the private system that their schools weren't going to be properly funded, and I think that left a very bad taste in everyone's mouth. And
why is this voting bloc important? Who are we talking about here?
Well, you're talking about the parochial Catholic school system, for example. You know, people that would, often vote Labor, and people who certainly need to be reassured that their education system that they operate under isn't going to be disadvantaged. And the government's given an ironclad guarantee in that regard, that not a dollar less is going to be spent in any of the independent and private school systems, but it is going to be a needs-based system, so that we're going to be able to improve the education system for Indigenous kids, people in remote areas, kids with disabilities, and the public sector generally, and I think that's a big plus.
Grahame, just on the politics of this is why Tony Abbott and Chris Pyne are going so hard on saying some private schools will lose out under this funding model. We are talking about an important block of swinging voters, you can call them aspirational voters, working families, whatever. This is the battleground on this issue, isn't it?
Well, that's right, and the Labor Party's got form in this area, and we're just not quite sure. That's why I think announcing it now is slightly unwise. And you think, why have they done this? And because it's sort of a little half-baked, you think, I know why they've done it. They've convinced themselves that they've got a bit of momentum by calming down a little bit the asylum thing, by doing the dental thing, even though the Prime Minister was overseas. And by doing this, I think they're hoping that the polls will start to shift. And they did shift a little. But what if the electorate has stopped listening? What if the polls tomorrow or next week show Labor going backwards? And that is the thing that you find that is just devastating for a Prime Minister, for a party, for her office, when you think and you've been told by the journalists you're going really, really well.
And this shot
but if next week the polls do the wrong thing, the psychology of that, having done all of this expenditure and let fly with a lot of your good ammo, if you go backwards, it's just devastating for the leadership.
We need to take a break. I want to talk, though, about Afghanistan. Yes, bipartisan support for maintaining our presence there, but what is the public view on this? What pressure is that going to be applying to both sides? Stay with us. PM agenda, we're talking to our panel of political strategists, Grahame Morris and Bruce Hawker. I want to look at the terrible news out of Afghanistan last week. 5 Australian soldiers killed in one day. As we've heard time and again, the worst day for the Australian forces since Vietnam. Now, the hunt has been underway for Sergeant Hekmatullah, the Afghan National Army recruit, who gunned down, well, in fact, 5 Australian soldiers. 3 of them died on that day, and 2 were wounded. In the effort to try and track him down, which has been a joint Afghan and Australian effort, there was a raid on a premises, and 2 Afghans were killed. 1 was taken into custody, and the Australians are pretty confident, and so is ISAF, by the way, the international forces there, that he is either an insurgent or linked to the insurgents and may have helped Sergeant Hekmatullah, this rogue soldier, escape. Now, the Afghan President Hamid Karzai has criticised this operation for not having Afghan approval. He's obviously concerned and under political pressure every time civilians are killed by foreign forces there. But Stephen Smith, our Defence Minister, hit back with this today.
The operation in question was fully authorised, was fully partnered, and the outcome of the operation has been the detention of an individual who is regarded not just as a leader of the insurgency in Oruzgan province, but a person who has also sought to or actually assisted Hekmatullah in his escape. And our ambassador in Kabul has made clear to the palace our disappointment at the statement issued from the palace over the weekend.
So Karzai's wrong. This operation did have Afghan approval, and it was worthwhile, essentially, is what the minister's saying there. But Grahame Morris, I know both sides of politics here in Australia support this, but you look at what's happened in the last week alone. You've got 3 Australian soldiers killed by someone where they're mentoring. That's why we're there. You've then got these disagreements between us and President Karzai about operations to track down the guy. A lot of people must be scratching their heads and going, what are we doing there? What the hell's going on?
Certainly some of the mood in the electorate has changed. And the idea that some of our brothers in arms would start shooting at us and killing our own is upsetting a lot of people, and the mood has changed. However, we cannot let that shift us from where we're going, because if these terrorists, if our opponents, if those forces are armed against us see that all it takes is to shoot a couple of our own and we go to water, that is no good. If we pull out, everyone who is left there is in real danger, much greater danger from the same thing.
It does go, this argument from the government that by the end of 2014 the Afghan National Army will apparently be able to look after security themselves. It sure doesn't look that way at the moment.
No, it doesn't, but we're all hoping that, you know, in the next 12 months things will improve a little. You know, if you haven't got that hope, then this all becomes very untidy. But the principle of getting them into a position where they can look after themselves is dead right. One hopes to hell it works.
Well, there's a lot at stake. Bruce, Graham's right, isn't he? There is growing public unease about this, but also on the backbench of both parties as well.
Well, there is some unease on the backbench of both parties, but I think to some extent it's well-founded. When it comes to Afghanistan, I must say I'm a pessimist. The last force to successfully occupy Afghanistan was led by Alexander the Great. And that's the hard reality that we're dealing with here. That doesn't mean by any means that we cut and run. I think Australia should see out its occupation and its commitments to the international forces, but we shouldn't expect, I think, that the government led by Hamid Karzai is going to last for a long time after 2014. In fact, he's already talked about, you know, working out some arrangement with the Taliban himself. So I think it's a terrible mess, and I can understand why people would feel the way they do about Afghanistan now. Having said that, you know, the prospect of a Taliban, you know, government, in inverted commas, running that country again is just appalling. The thought of women and girls being treated in the way they are under the Taliban, the way that education is just not part of the story for children, or girl children, is just an appalling story.
I think that's absolutely right. But if the government's argument has for so long been, and this is successive governments, that we've got to stop that happening, stop the Taliban coming back because, you know, it just becomes a terrorist breeding ground. After all, we've sacrificed and so much time there in Afghanistan. What happens in 2015 if the Taliban do come back, at least in parts of Afghanistan, like Helmand or Uruzgan? Well, what do we go back in there, or what?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, and I think there are a lot of people a lot smarter than me in military matters are probably scratching their heads about that as well. I do know, though, that you know, in 1975, after the US forces withdrew from Vietnam, the defeat of the South was just a matter of months and in coming. And I think there's nothing in what's happening in Afghanistan right now that fills me with any confidence at all that the existing Afghani forces are going to be able to withhold the Taliban. I hope they can, and I hope that our training forces there continue to, you know, arm and reinforce them. But I think that we're going to see a return to the Taliban eventually in Afghanistan. It's
a sad prospect.
Yeah.
It really is. Now we're nearly out of time, but Grahame Morris, I've got to mention the story that's kept you in the headlines for most of the last week. You're on ABC Radio and called Leigh Sales a cow. You apologised for it, but what were you thinking?
It wasn't my finest hour. In fact, I presume I'll win some award this year for being a goose. Yeah, look, I did apologise and I regretted it. You know, there's a fellow in a Labor MP, believe it or not, in England who has the same name as me, spelt the same way. And I copped a lot of flack this week, but he copped a lot of the backlash, and he was getting all these emails and phone calls and everything from Australia because of something I said. Look, I do regret it, but I also found it sort of I don't know, awkward that people saw this as sort of some attack on women. You know, that somehow or other, if it had been Kerry O'Brien instead of Leigh Sales, that I wouldn't have said it.
Would you have called him a cow, though?
Well, I think Kerry would say that he's had a rough deal over the years, and I've been fairly equal-handed. In fact, I think Kerry is one of the handful of the best interviewers this country has seen, and I actually regret some of the buckets I gave him over the years too.
Bruce, we've seen social media storms this week as well. It looks like Graham's been at the centre of at least.
I got hundreds and hundreds of emails. Yeah, scores and scores of phone calls, and the Twitterverse went absolutely berserk. And if you reckon what I said was crook, you should see what's come back at me.
I don't doubt that for a minute. We are out of time. Good to talk to you both. Grahame Morris, Bruce Hawker, thank you both very much for joining us. We'll catch up next week.